Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you on the West Coast. This is Josh Woolley, and on behalf of PCI, I'd like to welcome you all to today's GovCon 101, a guide to navigating FAR Part 52, joined by our expert instructor, David Gallacher. Before we begin, I do have a few housekeeping announcements. If you're new to our GovCon 101, we do welcome questions throughout the session, but we won't answer questions until we conclude the slides. There will be no password if you are seeking credit, but you will need to participate in the polls that will be at the end of the slides as well. So make sure you guys are tuned in and listening closely and engaging at the end if you are seeking credit for today's session. With that, I thank you all for joining. If you have any questions about getting credit, let me know. I will be more than happy to assist. If not, I'll hand it over to David.
Thank you so much, Josh Woolley. I appreciate it. Everybody, so good to see you here today. Thank you. My name is David Gallacher. I just want to put in a little bit of a reminder here. Questions are welcome. We're going to answer them all at the end, but if you have any questions, feel free to type those into the questions panel, and we'll catch those on the back end here. But this class today is a GovCon 101 on a guide to navigating FAR Part 52. And I must confess, when PCI approached me and said, "Can you help us walk through this a little bit?" I said, "Yeah, I'm happy to do it." FAR Part 52 is well, it's one of the most pivotal sections in the entire FAR, and it actually has a lot of rhyme to its reason as far as how it's laid out and exactly what it means, and we're going to unpack that a little bit here. Consequently, though, we're not going to get into a lot of the substance of the content of FAR Part 52. In that respect, this is really more of an instructional. My name is David Gallacher. I am an attorney with the law firm Kutak Rock in Washington, D.C., and I do just about everything relating to the FAR and the DFARs. I love cracking it open and trying to crack the code and figure out what the requirements are. I've been practicing for more than 20 years in the public procurement field. I do a lot on federal procurement, but I also do a fair bit on state and local, which don't necessarily apply FAR requirements directly, although sometimes they do as a contractual matter as some of those requirements get flowed down to the state or local governments. But I do a lot on helping clients figure out how to administer their contracts, figure out how to administer their subcontracts, and maybe most importantly, how to help them build out compliance programs so that they can stay on the right side of the contract and get business done instead of ending up on the wrong side of the contract and ending up in litigation. I'm there to help when things go sideways, but I know that nobody enters into these contracts saying, "Oh, I can't wait to hire David Gallacher to get me out of this litigation mess." Hopefully, the things we talked about here today will give you better insight into how your contracts are structured, how these contract clauses, what requirements they impose, so that, again, you can just get back to business of helping your customer and, well, avoiding the headache and the heartache of having to call a lawyer on this. So, pleasure to be here with you today. My contact information is there. If at the end of this you don't have time to type something into the questions panel, or you just have some kind of a follow-up question, feel free to reach out. You can send me an email or give me a call at my office. Happy to try to help you and point you in whatever direction I can. The materials, the handout materials are available for you in the handouts panel, I believe, and so you can download those and keep track of that as well. So there you go. Okay, so what are we going to talk about here today? The FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, is just big and it's thick. It's filled with hundreds upon hundreds of policies and prescriptions that are designed to protect the taxpayer and to enforce federal law. Now, some of this is driven by the White House. Some of this is driven by Congress, and so there's statutory requirements. Some of it is just policies that agencies are trying to fill out as they kind of color in between the lines that have otherwise been given to them by the courts or by the executive branch or by the legislative. And the FAR really tries to bring all that home. And that's really a big task here. But the policies and the prescriptions, they're typically implemented in the government contracts through FAR Part 52 contract clauses, which provide a listing of I think it's about more than 600 different contract clauses, many of which you will probably find in your government contracts themselves. And if you have all 600 of them plus, I'm sorry, you probably shouldn't. That could be whittled down, but we'll talk about that in a little bit here. So anyway, so as we go through this today, what I want to do is I want to start with an overview of the FAR, because it's important to know what FAR Parts 1 through 51 mean, and then we'll go and we'll talk about FAR Part 52. We'll talk about this principle here called the Christian doctrine, which is a unique principle in federal procurement law that has the potential to imply or to read in to your prime contract with the federal government particular contract clauses when they were accidentally or even in some cases intentionally omitted. So we'll talk a little bit about the Christian doctrine and how that overlaps a little bit with these contract clauses and solicitation provisions that are otherwise spelled out in FAR Part 52. We'll then shift a little bit from the prime contract perspective to the subcontract perspective and talk about how FAR Part 52 works in relation to flow downs. And spoiler alert, it doesn't. Really, the onus is on you to identify whichever FAR Part 52 contract clauses you have and make sure they're flowing down. And we'll talk a little bit about what that is. And then we'll close out here this session here with a few questions and answers, and again open it up if you have specific questions that you would like to ask. Just type those in to the questions panel. So now there's a question that's come up and from Kelly saying, I can't see anything. It looks like it's just loading. I don't know if that's on my end or yours, but Kelly, let me try to reshare and see if that's a problem. And I'm resharing my screen, and there you go. I hope that's good. If you still can't see anything, please work with Joshua Lee and see if she can help work that out for you. So, all right, well, let's get into FAR Part 52, or excuse me, into an overview of the FAR. Generally speaking, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, this is in Title 48 of the Code of Federal Regulations. Chapter 1. So this is an official regulation of the United States of America, and there you go. You can typically find these things online. The two resources that I typically turn to are acquisition.gov and ecfr.gov, and you can find them there. Those are hyperlinks if you want to click on them or just type those in, or you could just go into Google and type FAR, and these will typically be some of the top hits that come up for you. But these are nice because they give you it everywhere. There are, I often have a hard copy of the FAR that is that I keep at my desk to help me just as I kind of page through and flip back and forth. Those are available as well. The key advantage to some of these online resources is that they are constantly refreshed and renewed. And if you have a print copy, well, it's easy to go out of print because they are constantly re-updating the FAR on that. So I highly recommend those two resources at ecfr or at acquisition.gov. Great opportunities. The FAR typically applies government-wide. Whenever the United States of America is buying something through a procurement contract, the FAR will normally apply. Now, individual agencies may have agency-specific priorities or agency-specific statutes, and so there are supplements that each agency will issue. And the most common one of these is the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, or the DFARS, which many of you are probably familiar with. DoD spends an awful lot of procurement dollars on this, and so a lot of times you'll find your FAR clauses and your DFARS clauses. And the supplements typically implement agency unique requirements or something that is special about that particular agency's mission. They typically supplement. They don't typically displace, but occasionally they do. And when the agency specific requirement displaces whatever the requirement is in the FAR, they will make sure to let you know. And you see that a lot of times in DoD requirements relating to data rights, relating to country of origin, things like that. They say this is not supplementing the FAR, this is replacing the FAR with a particular unique DFARS requirement. But generally speaking, you have the FAR, and then that's overlaid with whatever the agency specific supplement is. And so in your contract, you're going to see FAR references. And, well, if it's a DHS, Department of Homeland Security contract, you're probably going to have HSAR, the Homeland Security Acquisition Regulation that will supplement it. Now, the FAR, importantly, only applies to direct procurements. These are direct procurements when the United States of America is buying a thing or a service. Spending through government grant regulations, through cooperative agreements, often even through other transaction agreements, those are administered through the grant programs are administered through the grant regulations at 2 CFR Part 200. That's Title 2 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 200. And so there are some different unique requirements that might be administered through that often come out in terms of cooperative agreements and other transaction agreements. If you find yourself spending federal grant dollars, and often that might happen as it's administered down through the federal government appropriates the dollars or Congress appropriates the dollars and they grant that out to state and local governments, what you often might find is some of these other 2 CFR Part 200 requirements. Sometimes they drag in and pull in FAR requirements because, hey, it's a good articulation of what it is that the agency is trying to express. But generally speaking, that kind of a hodgepodge is not normal. Normally, when you're dealing with a grant, you're dealing with the 2 CFR Part 200 requirements. When you're dealing with a direct procurement by the United States of America, you are dealing with these 48 CFR requirements in the FAR or the agency supplements. Okay, now the new rules, because these are regulations, these are federal regulations that apply across the United States of America, new rules and regulations are subject to notice and comment. And what that means is, typically speaking, the government will publish these and say, okay, constituencies, stakeholders, people out there in the public, we want to make sure that we, the government, are moving in a deliberate and not an arbitrary fashion. Our Constitution guarantees due process, and so part of that process is the government says, we're going to solicit your input when it comes to issuing new regulations. Now, it doesn't mean they will listen to your input. You might disagree with what they're doing, and oftentimes the FAR councils, when they're amending the FAR, will say, look, we understand that you, Dave Gallacher, wrote in comments saying, I don't like this, I don't think it's a good policy, but we're sorry, commenter, we have a statute that we have to implement, and so whether or not it's good policy or not, that's for Congress to decide. We are here just trying to implement this. So typically what will happen is these new rules, these updates to the FAR, are published in the Federal Register, often in the form of one of these periodic, what they call the Federal Acquisition Circulars. And those are the ways that they specifically go through and typically aggregate some of these updates to the procurement regulations. And they will publish those in the Federal Register and seek comment on that. And typically these rules are manifested in one of 3 ways. First is a proposed rule, and that basically says, hey, this is what we are thinking about doing. This is the text that we intend to update with. Comments. What are things in there that are unclear? What are things that we can improve? And they will typically give the public about 30, sometimes 60 days of feedback, and you have the chance to formally submit those. These comments are typically publicly available and publicly viewable, and they're available through the website, I think, that the government typically has is, I think it's regulations.gov, where they will post a lot of these things. But you can chime in and share with the rule makers what you think is good or bad about a particular rule. And then once they have all that feedback, they will continue to process that a little bit, and then eventually they will issue a final rule. And the final rule often says, we didn't receive any feedback, so we're implementing as originally suggested. Or the final rule may say, we've thought a little bit better of this. We've got some comments on this, and so here's how we're going to change it. Proposed rules are designed to give you a chance to iron out some of the problems, but the final rule is where it goes final. The third way, though, here is what they call an interim rule, and an interim rule is a little bit of a hybrid. And this is when they basically say the rule makers, the FAR councils that implement these updates to the FAR, they come in and they basically say, look, we've got a statutory mandate, or we have an executive order, we have something we need to move out quickly. And we need to get out there to implement this priority that has been set by the White House or by Congress. So they will sometimes push out an interim rule. And the idea behind that is it typically has immediate or near immediate effect, but they're still working on it. They're still, we're going to be remodeling the house while we're living in it, if you will. And they are typically saying we are open to feedback on what can be improved on this. And of course, it's going to be a little bit of a learning machine, because as they're implementing it in real time and learning what works, what doesn't work, these interim rules will often get implemented and moved into a final rule once some of that learning has happened as to what is good or what is bad about that. They don't like doing interim rules because it feels a little rushed, right? It feels a little arbitrary. They don't always have the chance to solicit inputs and then try to adapt accordingly. But interim rules are issued sometimes. I think, as I think through, like the right now, the Section 889 restrictions relating to the purchase, or rather the limitations on purchase and use of certain Chinese origin telecommunications equipment, that has been an interim rule that's been out for about 4 years, and we still don't have a final rule on that. Why? They're still working through the working through the problems, I guess, on that. But anyway, so that's typically how the FAR gets updated. And there are lists you can go through and Google of the FAR Council's agenda, various cases that they have open, various proposed issues that they're exploring. They try to be fairly transparent as far as what's in their pipeline and when it's coming out. But the FAR is constantly changing. Now, in addition to these formal updates, you also have what's called a class deviation, or excuse me, it's a deviation. You may have contract-specific deviations, or more commonly, agency-wide class deviations. And we'll talk about this more in just a few minutes. But these deviations may be agency-specific modifications to meet some specific circumstances that the agency is in, or sometimes to meet a specific statutory requirement. In effect, a deviation operates much like an interim rule, but the key difference is it's not necessarily changing the regulation, it's changing the implementation as a policy matter. And then there can also be additional policies and memoranda that the agency issues that may implement agency priorities. Most notably for this is DoD has what they call their Procedures, Guidance, and Information, their PGI. And these are practical policy implementations. These are not regulations, but often they're read hand in hand. You have the FAR, you have the DFARs. Those are regulations. Those are typically subject to notice and comment. Maybe there's a deviation or two to some of these DFARS clauses, right? But then the PGI is read as kind of a tool to help contracting officers and procurement professionals help implement some of these requirements. So the FAR, generally speaking, this is kind of the table of contents of the FAR. It's broken up into 7, or I guess 8 different subchapters. And within each of those subchapters, there are a number of parts that deal with a particular aspect or policy priority in this. And so you see subchapter A, general. Part 1 deals with the federal acquisition regulation system generally, and it talks about structurally how how the FAR is laid out and how Title 48 is structured. FAR Part 2 talks about definition, words and terms that apply throughout the entire FAR. Part 3, improper business practices and personal conflicts of interest. Part 4, administrative and information matters, and so on and so forth. Some of these things get lumped together here with where you have like subchapter D that deals with socioeconomic programs. FAR Part 19 deals with small business programs. FAR Part 22 deals with labor priorities. FAR Part 25 deals with foreign acquisition, Buy American, prohibition on certain foreign sources, things like that. The point of this is that every policy gets plugged in somewhere into the FAR, and it relates to one of these FAR parts. The most recent update on this is the new edition of FAR Part 40, Information Security and Supply Chain Security. This is really kind of a shell right now waiting to be populated, but this is where all of the cybersecurity requirements are going to be living once they're currently they're scattered throughout the FAR. You have a lot in FAR Part 4 relating to administrative and information matters, but eventually they're all going to be pulled together and put into FAR Part 40. They have just recently, in the last few months, named it, set up a structure, and it's just waiting for somebody to move in there on that. The reason why this is important is FAR Part 52 focuses on solicitation provisions and contract clauses. And so what it is, this is essentially the central clearinghouse through which all of these priorities in the first 51 parts basically get implemented through some kind of a solicitation provision or contract clause. And you can find out which part it came from by structurally how that is described in FAR Part 52, and we'll look at that here in just a minute. Now, there's also a FAR Part 53 forms. This is where a lot of these standard procurement forms come from. We're not going to get into FAR Part 53 here, but 52 and 53 are really designed to be the implementation part of parts of FAR Parts 1 through 51. So, okay, so the way the FAR is structured is it does try to have a little bit of rhyme and reason to it. It will have a section, or excuse me, it will have a part number. So in this case, it's FAR Part 25 relating to foreign acquisitions. Dot 1, okay, the 1 comes down and cross-references to a subpart. So you know that that is within FAR subpart 25.1, not 25.2, not 25.3. FAR 25.1 implements the Buy American Act when the government is buying supplies. So you know, okay, this right here would relate to supplies under the Buy American Act as opposed to maybe the Trade Agreements Act, or which is 25.4, or to the construction materials, which is 25.2. So you can get a sense from this regulation as to exactly where it sits and what policy it's trying to implement. The next set of numbers here are the section. So you have 25.108. 25 tells us it's from FAR Part 25. 0.1 tells us it's from subpart 25.1. But 25.108 is the actual section number within this that is implementing the priority. And then -2 is the subsection within that. And just because I love the FAR and I love that sometimes it's a little funny to read, just for your awareness, this graphic is taken directly out of the FAR, and there is no section 25.108-2. So while this is actually in the regulations, this section is not actually in the regulations. Go figure. But that's generally speaking the structure of the FAR. So you can often look at it and give you a sense, okay, this is what it is. And as you get familiar with the FAR and understand, okay, what Part 19 and Part 25 and Part 22 and some of these are, you can get a sense oftentimes just by looking at a regulation as to where it fits in the overall procurement priorities and policies and that are trying to be implemented. FAR Parts 1 through 51 implement the procurement regulations. FAR Part 52 are the solicitation provisions and contract clauses. Let me be clear, those two categories. These are provisions that should be included in solicitations, often to help you respond to a particular RFP opportunity. And then, of course, the other are the contract clauses that will control at the end of the day once that contract is awarded. Now, these FAR Part 52 provisions or clauses typically have 4 flavors. This is my grouping on this. You don't really see this spelled out or defined like this, but typically these provisions and clauses, I like to think of them in one of these 4 buckets. Oftentimes they're instructional. They are telling you what you need to do. And an example of that is FAR 52.202-1, that basically is these are the definitions that are going to apply for this. You also have, for instance, 52212 dash, is it 2? That's instructions to offerors. Anyway, but it specifically says in its title there that it is instructions, and it helps you know and understand how you should be handling or structuring your contract, or how you should be responding to the particular solicitation. The second bucket here of types that you have here with these solicitation provisions and clauses are typically, sometimes these are certifications. And an example of this is 52212-3, which is for commercial products and commercial services, and offerors, representations, and certifications. This is fairly standard. Most of those provisions there have actually been brought out, and when you register on the federal website at sam.gov, the System for Award Management, sam.gov, you will go through and complete some of these certifications. Some certifications are certifications of adherence, meaning by performing, you are impliedly certifying that you're adhering to this. Some certifications require an express response. I mentioned the Chinese origin telecommunications equipment at, I think it's 204-25. You need to go through and specifically check boxes associated with those certifications. The third bucket here are prohibitions. These are prohibitions that are, I guess, similar to a little bit of those certifications of adherence, but these are contract provisions where you, as the contractor, are basically saying, I agree not to do a particular thing. There's prohibitions on doing business with Iran or with Sudan under FAR Part 25.7. You also have my example here of 52204-30, which is one of the newest updates, one of the newest clauses added to the FAR just several months ago. Federal Acquisition Supply Chain Security Act orders. It's a prohibition. And basically it says that if the federal government issues an exclusion order from the Federal Acquisition Supply Chain Security Committee, FASCSA, if they issue something excluding a particular source or a particular company, then you, contractor, agree that you will not buy from them. There is a prohibition on that. And so the problem on some of these prohibitions is that they can evolve over time, but the prohibition nonetheless remains. The fourth kind of bucket that we have here of the type of solicitation provisions and clauses that we're dealing with here are, frankly, the far most common, and that is just it's an express requirement that's going to be in your solicitation or in your contract. And since I've already started talking about some of the Buy American requirements here, for instance, 52225-1, Buy American supplies, and it basically says that you, contractor, agree to deliver only domestically manufactured products. And so it's imposing an affirmative obligation to you. And if you don't do that, well, maybe you have a false certification, but most especially you could have a breach of contract, and a breach of contract carries with it breach remedies, possible default, et cetera, et cetera. Every single one of these requirements, you need to be aware of what they are so that you can understand, okay, is it an instruction, something that's more informational that I can set to the side? Is it a certification? Is it a prohibition? Is it a requirement? Because I would hate to think that you ignore some of these things, say, that's just boilerplate. These are imposing regulatory requirements on you through your contract, and you need to be aware of that. Okay, now let's move on to FAR Part 52 specifically. All FAR provisions and clause numbers begin with a 52.2. And the reason for this is because the clauses are located in FAR Part 52. And FAR 52.2 specifically deals with the text of these various clauses. So that's the nice thing, structurally speaking. So, and agency supplements will follow a similar format. So what we have here is 52.2 tells you that it is from the FAR 52.2, which is the contract clauses or the solicitation provisions. So at 52.2, a lot of times I will pull up a new contract and I'll just Control F, go in and do 52.2. I don't leave my search there, but that's a nice way to kind of cut to the chase, because anything that is a FAR or an agency supplement to this is going to have that 52.2 in there somewhere. Now, if you have something like the DFARS, it's going to follow a similar format, but it will actually be DFARS like 252 because it's from Chapter 2 of Title 48 for the DFARS as opposed to Chapter 1 that is the FAR generally. So using again, the example in the FARs, you have this one particular clause that we're looking at. 52.2 tells you this is an official contract clause. It's then followed by the 43. So it's 52.243. And what that tells you is this clause relates to section 43, which is contract changes. Or more particularly, this is a clause that is prescribed by FAR Part 43. So if you need more information on this, you can flip back to FAR Part 43 and find out a little bit more about the policies and the regulations that are implementing this particular clause. It's then followed here by a dash and then the particular number. And that's the subsection, or more particularly, it is a sequential number within 52.243 to show you that unique clause. And these clauses are not typically, actually, they are very rarely, I say not typically because sometimes the government trips on itself, right? But these are not reused. So -1, -2, -3, those are unique clauses applying different requirements. And then, of course, each clause also has a title associated with it so that you can find more out about it, oftentimes at a glance. So when I see 52.243-1, comma, changes fixed price, I know that it's an official contract clause from FAR 52.2. I know that it is implementing changes for fixed price contracts, and I know that this is the unique -1 clause and that the requirements are derived from FAR Part 43. I can tell all of that just by that numerology nomenclature there of how this is titled. As I mentioned before, there's about 600 plus provisions and clauses that are in 52.2, and they all follow this format. There are hundreds of other agency-specific supplements, and they, again, follow this same format. For DFARS, it would be 252. For GSA, I think it's 552. For the VA, I think it's 852, because they're in chapters 2, 5, and 8 respectively, which is where that is where that's coming from. But this 52.2 formulation is a great tool to shortcut to tell you, this is an official regulatory clause requirement. Okay, so now we know how to spot them. So now what? Well, you're typically going to find these in your contract in one of two ways. One, they're going to be called out by full text. And this is where in the solicitation or in the contract, it's going to spend 2 or 3 pages spelling out a particular clause. 225-1 Buy America Supplies, or 243-1 changes fixed price. Or, more commonly, they are just incorporated by reference, which is to say, often what the language in the contract says is the following clauses are incorporated by reference, and they just list them. There you go. Now, when they list these are supposed to have a date associated with them, because as we talked about before, these clauses are refreshed and updated from time to time, and so there's a difference. We'll look at the dating here in just a second. But oftentimes you don't find that date. And part of it is because people don't want to, it's just hard to be constantly refreshing with all of these little variations on the dates here. So a lot of times I see companies that will flow these down or include these in the terms and conditions, and they don't include a date. We'll come back to what that means there on that. But ideally, the incorporation by reference should include a specific date. Now, there might also be customer unique provisions and clauses. Those are typically going to be spelled out in whole, especially if they are not available through some of these regulatory sources. And where you're typically going to find these in your solicitation or in your contract are in Section H, which is normally the special contract requirements required by that particular customer for this particular procurement. In Section I, and oftentimes Section I will include the list of clauses, but not necessarily incorporate them by full text. And then, of course, for some of these certification provisions and clauses, those are often called out in Section K, representations, certifications, and other statements of offerors. If they derive off of the FAR or an agency supplement certification, then they will often be included there in Section K. But if it's a certification that relates to a unique contract requirement, then it might actually not call out one of these 52.2 references, because it could be unique for that particular customer for that particular contract. Okay, dates. Each provision or clause may be updated from time to time, and this is because maybe some of the language in it has grown a little stale, maybe the policy has been updated, maybe Congress or the White House or even the courts have spoken to an issue, and so it just needs to be refreshed. These contract clause dates should be listed in there. And in point of fact, the FAR requires them to. The standard clauses are all dated with a month, year reference to clarify which version will apply. Now, which version will apply, right? You might look at 243-1 from April 1984 versus August 1987, which is the latest version of this clause. Yeah, seriously. 243-1 changes clause has not changed in the last 37 years. The question is there a difference between the two of them? And the answer is not really substantively. But nonetheless, they are different clauses. And so if you want to make sure that the 84 version applies, then that was the version that should be referenced in your contract. But in those two situations here with the changes clause, there hasn't been much change that's happened in that. And like I said, no change over the last 37 years. By comparison on this, though, if you look at the Buy America requirements, through the Trump and Biden administrations, there's been an increased push toward Buy America requirements. And so there's a big difference between Buy America supplies from February 2009 and through the current version of the clause, which is October 2022. Those are very different clauses as far as what they require, because they're implementing very different requirements coming out of the White House. As a practical matter on this, whichever version is in your contract is the version that you need to meet. So let's say I got a contract in January 2009, and let's say it just happens to be taking 15 years to perform because, well, I don't know, it's a big, long contract. Even though the policies might have changed in the last 15 years, the contract requirement might not have. I say might because it's entirely possible the contracting officer has gone in and refreshed the clause, which actually you shouldn't do, right? Like we signed on to this in January 2009 on a certain understanding, and when you change these clauses, there can be additional requirements associated with it, hence the changes clause. But leaving that aside, so oftentimes it may come through where if I'm awarding a subcontract in 2024, and I just flow down 52.225-1, and I'm unclear as to the date on that, sometimes I can get myself into a little bit of a mix-up because I haven't flowed down the right version of the clause. And so maybe I'm asking my subcontractor to do something different than what I promised to do my prime contractor. So look, I think it's a good idea to always make sure that you are as clear as possible relating to the date on the clause. Now, I realize a lot of times companies don't do this because they don't want to be in there constantly updating their templates, especially when it comes to flow down clauses. And so they will typically just say 225-1, whatever version that is. Sometimes people say, well, it'll self-refresh, and I don't think that's actually correct. If there is no date listed, I think that the conventional wisdom is whatever version of the clause was in effect as of the day that you signed a particular contract, that's likely to be the version of the clause that would apply. I think that that's the right legal conclusion to reach, although I'm not sure that there's much case law on that. The idea that it self-refreshes is, I think, not the right way of thinking, but sometimes we give ourselves a little bit of comfort. I think most often we leave out the dates just because it clutters things up, and it has the potential that if I am awarding a contract in 2024 with an August 1987 clause, it feels like I'm just really late to the game and I need to update my things a little bit here. So, but each of these clauses should have a specific clause date, and you should be mindful of that. Now, each clause also has a particular unique prescription associated with it. And at the beginning of the clause itself, in FAR subpart 52.2, it's going to say where this clause is required. So sticking with 243-1 changes and 225-1 Buy American Supplies, these start off saying as prescribed in FAR Part 43.205 or FAR 25.1101. That's how we know. If we want to get more understanding of this, we can go back to that to get this. So every single one of these clauses includes this prescription in the introductory text of each of the provisions or clauses. And that's helpful for you if you need to track this down. Now, in addition to that, though, there's also instructions as far as whether or not alternate versions of some of these clauses might come into play. Alternate versions address slightly different circumstances that might require slightly different requirements. So, for instance, here in 243-1, you have fixed prices. They say insert this clause. You should use the main clause when you have a fixed price contract for supplies. But if it's going to be for fixed price services with no supplies, you should use 243-1 alternate 1. And the way that that's expressed is in parentheses. It just says alt 1 or alternate 1. And again, typically those alternates are always dated as well. If it's for services where there are supplies going to be furnished, then you use 243-1 alternate 2. If it's for architect or engineering or other professional services, alt 3. If it's for transportation services, alt 4. R&D contracts, alt 5. So a lot of times this is avoiding having to create 5 or 6 different versions of the exact same clause. It's just minor alterations in that. 52.225-1 is kind of another example on this. When the if there's a different domestic content threshold that might come in, then you use a different version of the clause than what you have in your standard mainline. And again, as you look at the Buy American clause in there, this comes in when you have a contract that exceeds the micro purchase threshold of $10,000, but does not exceed $50,000. So in truth, this 225-1 clause actually is much more narrow than I think we typically see in that. So anyway, you do not normally see in a contract alternates of the same contract, meaning it would be unusual for you to have 225-1, the base clause, and 225-1 alternate, because normally you're not coexisting in that same space. The circumstances when you typically see alternates coexisting at the same time is often when the government is not really sure what it's buying. We're buying services, but we don't know if it will or will not have supplies. So in that case, the government may very well use 243-1 alt 1 and alt 2 in there, and then however that plays out would kind of activate whichever one of those clauses. But the alternates are designed to be minor variations of standard clauses, and typically the way an alternate reads is substitute this new paragraph C for the standard paragraph C because we're dealing with architect and engineering or services or something along those lines. So that's how the alternates typically play in. Now, modifications to these clauses. Typically, you don't get to do this. Most FAR provisions and clauses are as is. They are non-negotiable. You don't like them? Well, then don't bid on the opportunity here. But with that being said, some provisions or clauses do require modifications. Some of these are fill in the blank. Some of these specifically say that the contract must include a provision that says substantially the same as, or a lot of times there may be kind of flow downs that say you must flow this down using substantially the same language as. So in that case, you are allowed a little bit of leeway in that. Some provisions are blanks to be completed by offerors, especially you see that a lot with the certifications that are included in these contracts. But the important thing on this is that doesn't give you the chance to rewrite the clause necessarily. Occasionally, the government customer might allow that in unique circumstances, but generally speaking, that's not what you're doing. For these slight modifications, you need to make sure that those are being included in the solicitation so you're on notice, and that you're responding to those appropriately in the offer or in the contract itself. I run into this every now and then where for instance, you have 52244-2, which is the subcontracts clause. It's essentially, it requires and implements it requires in some circumstances the government's consent to subcontracts. And it's one of those fill in the blank clauses. And it basically says if certain circumstances are met, then the government will only require consent to subcontract for these clauses. Blank, or for these subcontractors, and it's blank. I've had situations where the government customer comes in after the fact and says, oh, we want to fill that in now, 6 months later. It doesn't work like that. Blank means blank. If the government wants to later renegotiate and modify a clause, you're happy to do, or you may be happy to do that, but that may very well be a FAR 52243-1 changes. So I mentioned this earlier before talking about deviations. Deviations may be necessary to meet specific needs and requirements of each agency. Deviations are issued by agency heads. Deviations are usually agency specific, and far-wide deviations are very rare. Point of fact, I don't know that I can think of any that I've seen that are far-wide, but it's a complicated world, this procurement system here. I've got a QR code here for some of the DoD class deviations. DoD issues a lot of these because there's an annual DoD appropriations bill that comes out and always has a little bit of unique requirements. So DoD is always adapting to that. And they don't always have the time to issue a proposed rule or an interim rule or a final rule to implement it. There's two types of deviations that are issued. The first is a class deviation. This is similar in effect to an interim rule, and it typically has immediate effect, but it also typically also has a little bit of an expiration associated with it, which is why they're doing it as a deviation instead of as a formal rulemaking through the Federal Register. You also have individual deviations that are contract specific, and these are often negotiated. The individual deviations often have the same flavor as a formal modification to a clause. You see this a lot with where the government is issuing deviations or modifying some of the requirements for specifically what they want from offerors in a solicitation, or what they're requiring from you as far as delivery requirements. Those kinds of things that are going to be very unique to a particular procurement. You might have those individual deviations, but that's going to apply only to a specific procurement. It's not going to apply agency-wide. Those require a class deviation. So the formatting on this that you might typically see is, for example, this is a real DoD class deviation here, 252.225-7972. That tells me, remember the 252 tells me it's from the DFARS. The 52.2 tells me that it is an official regulatory requirement that they're implementing. The .225 tells me it's from foreign acquisitions, so it relates to some kind of Buy American or foreign prohibition. And then -7972 means that that's the unique number for this clause. And it relates to prohibition on the procurement of foreign-made unmanned aircraft systems. You have the clause date, August 2024, and then the deviation associated with it, which is in this case 2024-00014. And there you go. Sometimes it might be deviation September 2024. DoD tends to number their deviations because they just have a lot more that they're dealing with, and they just want to make sure they're keeping track of them. So that's how you're going to notice and see a deviation. That's the format that will typically follow in that. Okay, we've talked about 52.1 gives you instructions, 52.2 gives you all the clauses, and then you have 52.3 that takes you through this cute little matrix. And I've got a QR code there if you want to scan on it or click on it to take you here. It's a little bit of a quaint relic of an earlier time. The FAR was implemented in '84, which was a much more analog time, and I think most of this is more automated now. I don't know that I've ever talked to any contracting professionals that use this today, but the matrix is designed to basically identify each of those 600 plus clauses. That's in the far left column. Tells you where it's prescribed by. Tells you, is it a solicitation provision or is it a clause? And then it goes through and talks about, okay, what type of contract is it required in? Is it only required when it's applicable? Is it an optional clause? And you see through some of these clauses here, you have fixed price supply, cost reimbursable supply, fixed price R&D, I don't know what all of these acronyms stand for, and I won't read them out to you, but it's designed to be basically a little bit of a, well, frankly, it's a matrix to help you know how to structure which clauses will apply. And as I said, I think that most companies, and I think the government nowadays generally automates this, so you're not typically using the 52.3 matrix, but it's there, and it's a little cute, but it's also a little old-timey. Okay, so that's the FAR structure. That's the 52.2 structure. And I mentioned how you're going to find these 52.2 clauses in your contracts. The question always comes up, though, but Dave, what happens if I don't have a clause in my contract? When you are a prime contractor doing business directly with the government, there is always the risk under this doctrine called the Christian doctrine that a particular prime contract clause might be read into your prime contract as a matter of law. The Christian doctrine goes back about 60 years. Christian was I think they were an architect and engineering firm, and they were doing some design work for the government. And through the course of the contract negotiations, they basically said, we want to get this termination for convenience clause out. And the contracting officer said, okay, that's fine. That's fine. And so the contracting officer negotiated that out, redlined it. You get into performance a little bit, and then the government decides we want to terminate this for convenience. And Christian rightly says, but you can't. It's not in our contract. And the government argued that it was implied as a matter of law. And ultimately, the Court of Claims agreed with that thinking. So certain rules and contract clauses will have the force and effect of law, even though they are not expressly incorporated in a prime contract. What clauses, Dave? I'd really like to know. Well, I can't, I mean, there are lists out there. There's maybe about 10 or 12 or so clauses that have been Christianed in. But the hallmark on these that the court considers is whether or not this issue represents a deeply ingrained strand of public procurement policy. And if it does, then there's a chance that it's going to be Christianed in. As is the case with the termination for convenience clause, as it was at that time. Now, the court also reasoned as well that the contracting officer didn't actually have the authority to remove that clause. So even though the contracting officer, yes, redlined it out, no, he shouldn't have done that, because this is very important to the government to help it manage its procurement portfolio. So there's an authority aspect to it where what Congress says is required is going to trump whatever it is that's happening down there in the day-to-day operation of this. The bottom line on this is that there is a legal risk for all prime contractors when it comes to the Christian doctrine, that even if your contract does not include a specific clause, it could be deemed to include that clause by operation of law. Now, I have to get the question, does the Christian doctrine apply at the subcontract level? And the answer is no, with a caveat. There are some that argue that it should, but the majority of the law that's out there right now says no. There's a different, there are different policies at play when it comes to a prime contractor, commercial company doing business with another commercial company, than when you are the sovereign United States of America doing business with a prime contractor. So the Christian doctrine applies to prime contractors, maybe probably not to subcontractors, but it's always hanging there in the background there when it comes to primes. Okay, last topic that I want to get through here is we're heading into the end here, is relating to flow downs. So you have these 52.2 clauses that are in your contract. Many of them include language that specifically says, I, prime contractor, will flow this clause down to my subcontractors and suppliers. Technically, subcontractors is a broadly enough defined term. In FAR 44.1, that suppliers are included in subcontractors, but nonetheless. So, and I've just got three clauses here that I picked out here. We've got the Anti-Kickback Act. We've got the 204-21, which is basically the mainline cybersecurity provisions, and then you have 222-50, which is combating trafficking in persons. These all have flow down requirements, and it says the contractor agrees to incorporate the substance of this clause, including this paragraph, in its subcontracts. And the idea behind that is that I, as the prime, flow it down to you, my subcontractor. Now you've got this clause. And now you actually have this clause because it includes this paragraph, right? So technically, the idea behind this is that you should be flowing it down to the third level, and they should be flowing it down to the fourth. And if the government has its way, this important socioeconomic policy relating to restricting kickbacks, to cybersecurity, to preventing trafficking in persons, that gets all the way down, reached down through the supply chain. Now, in truth, this is going to drop out sometime or another, but oftentimes these clauses include specific provisions that require the flow down. And sometimes it's a partial flow down, and maybe it will be limited on certain circumstances. Sometimes the quantities of flow down are limited if it's a commercial subcontract versus a non-commercial subcontract. So even though, for instance, I have a clause, let's say I have a prime contract that has that Anti-Kickback Act clause. If I'm awarding a non-commercial subcontract, then that's actually not on the list of contracts or clauses that I must flow down. So even though it says I must, I actually am more in the realm of a may. Do I have to? No, and that subcontractor may often push back on that. This is not a flow down class. I teach those separately for PCI, but if you have a commercial subcontract, then flow downs are typically limited, and there are some provisions in the FAR and the DFARs that talk about that you should try to limit flow downs in subcontracts for commercial products and commercial services. If you have a non-commercial subcontract where you can't claim that FAR Part 12 special commercial status, you're probably going to end up taking just about everything that the prime chooses to flow down, and that's going to be a whole lot of 52.2 somethings. And maybe these are spelled out by full text, maybe they are incorporated by reference, but the subcontractor in that case has very little leverage. Now, when it comes to these flow downs, as I said, there's a difference between mandatory flow downs and necessary flow downs. Some clauses are mandated by law, and the clauses that you must flow down are listed at 52244-6 and at 52212-5E. Again, coming back to this, 52.2 tells us it's an official clause. Part 44 tells us it deals with subcontracting policies and procedures. -6 tells us that it's that unique clause. 52.212 tells us it's 52.2 it's an official clause. 212 tells us it's part of FAR Part 12, which is commercial products and commercial services, and then it's the -5 unique clause. So they specifically list the clauses, and it's 20 plus clauses that says these need to be flowed down in all circumstances, commercial, non-commercial, doesn't matter. But even beyond those mandatory flow downs, a lot of times there are practical or necessary flow downs that prime contractors need to ensure are flowed down to ensure contract compliance. So if you're a sub, you maybe have a little bit of leverage to push back a little, but if your prime needs you to do this, I don't know, that's a matter of negotiations. Prime contractors are directed to limit their flow downs. And specifically the 244-6 clause, and then the DFAR supplement at 244-7000 says that they shall not include any of these additional clauses. So there's a little bit of a tension there for prime contractors. How much do I flow down? How much do I hold back? And I think the practical answer here is you need to flow down what you need to flow down, and you know your customer requirements best. And subcontractor, if you don't like it, you're going to have to get into a little bit of a risk assessment. We often engage in this process of what we call assessing as to whether or not something is self-deleting. I try to flow something down to you, and you say, but Dave, it doesn't apply. And I say, well, in that case, then it's just self-deleting. And you find this as well sometimes in prime contracts where you have clauses that just don't apply. I'm providing, let's say, Post-it notes to the federal government. I'm not sure that I really need to have combating trafficking in persons in this. Right? Because the clause itself specifically says that parts of this only apply when it is being performed outside the United States and is valued over $550,000. I'm selling you Post-it notes. This clause shouldn't apply. Can we get it removed? And oftentimes we engage, like I said, in this fiction of, well, it's self-deleting then. It won't apply. Like the facts don't activate it. And so legally it will never kind of bloom into existence in your contract. And we engage in this, like I said, we draw down on this fiction here because it just helps the other side assess the risk. If I'm a prime trying to flow this down to you, my post-it note supplier, I say, well, it shouldn't apply, so let's just keep it in, and are you okay with that? Importantly, I want us all to know there is no such thing as self-deleting. This is a fiction that we engage in to just try to get to the bottom line on this. But the concept may help a subcontractor assess the relative risk of a clause. Because, for instance, if I'm taking, if I'm doing subcontract work for you, and I am performing commercially available off-the-shelf work, or I don't have access to certain controlled information, then this 204-21 clause shouldn't apply. So can't I just say it doesn't apply by its own terms? And maybe I can. Maybe I can. Of course, the other side of it is, but now that it's in your subcontract, haven't you agreed to something? I don't really know on that. But anyway, we often engage in this idea of self-deleting at both the prime and the subcontract level to make peace with a clause that shouldn't be there. And we just go ahead and sign anyway on that. The government uses this a lot as to justify why it has dozens upon dozens and hundreds of clauses in there saying, well, it's just in there because we need it, and if it doesn't apply, it's self-deleting. Remember, though, self-deleting is a fiction. If it's in your contract, technically, it's in your contract. Now, I mentioned this before, flow downs, the Christian doctrine does not apply at the subcontract level. Clauses must be referenced, incorporated specifically in a subcontract in order to apply. So we're at about the 1 hour mark. And this is where we are going to go into the quiz recap. Joshua Lee, do you want to read these or do you want me to?
Whatever works for you.
Okay, let me have you read it, and I'm going to drink some water here for a minute. So go ahead. Number one.
First question, true or false, the FAR solicitation provisions and contract clauses apply anytime a government entity spends money. I'll give you guys a moment.
Is that A, true, or B, false? Anytime the government is spending money, you're going to find a FAR clause in there that's activating that. What do you guys think on that? Is that a true or false? All right. We'll give it a few more seconds. Last, Diane gives it a thumbs up, which tells me, yeah, thumbs up, that's false. Thumbs up, that's true. What? No. We're getting close, guys. We're going to close it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, this is a fairly even split. And the answer is it's false. It's false. Remember that FAR chapter, the FAR applies only when the federal government is buying supplies or services through a direct procurement contract. The FAR does not normally apply to cooperative agreements or other transaction agreements, although government agencies may sometimes choose to draw in FAR provisions and clauses in those types of agreements. That's them trying to use something that's a little bit of an industry standard and say this might be a little bit simpler here. Let me draw down on that thinking. But it's not because it necessarily applies. It's because they're choosing to apply it. Most importantly, the FAR does not apply when a state or local government is spending federally appropriated dollars that were dispersed under a federal grant. Grant dollars are typically subject to the regulations at Title II of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 200, as well as agency-specific supplement. This is false because the FAR solicitation provisions and contract clauses apply anytime the government has a direct procurement contract that it is awarding, not necessarily because the federal government is spending money. So that was a close one, and sorry if I was not clearer on that at the beginning. Let's move on to number 2. Joshua Lee.
Based on the numbering convention set forth in FAR Part 52, which of the following would reference a FAR solicitation provision or contract clause? I'll give you guys a moment. You guys can send If your answer is F, you can send that through the questions tab.
Right, although in truth, it's not F because it doesn't fit there. But yeah, is it 25.1101? Is it 52.225? Or is it 225.502? Or is it a combination of some of these? And I realize while we're waiting for all these to come in, I did structure this question in a way that if you are dyslexic, I apologize. I wanted to, make this specifically a little confusing, but the idea of inverting, 225 or 52.225, that can be confusing, but I did it specifically to try to highlight the point here. So we'll give it 3 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, looks like we've got B and D are the most common answers on this. So B is the correct answer. It's not necessarily. So 25.1101 is part of the prescription that tells you whether or not the specific FAR clause would come into play here for 52.225-5. But the clause itself, you know that it's special because it has the 52.2, and that's the most important part that follows there. The 225 reference is just a reference to the DFARS in this. So let me read my answer here. Remember that because all the solicitation provisions and contract clauses are contained in FAR subpart 52.2, each of these provisions or clauses will begin with 52.2. In the case of 52.225-5 trade agreements, the 52.2 reflects the fact that this is a standard FAR provision or clause. The 25 reflects that the clause is required under FAR Part 25 foreign acquisitions, and the -5 reflects that this is the 5th sequential clause required under FAR Part 25. The other answers are incorrect. 25.1101 is the regulatory provision that prescribes when 52.225 should be used. So because you don't have that 52.2 on the 25.1101, that's why that is not a correct answer. It's not. Yes, it is a regulation, but no, it is not the specific contract clause. And 225.502 is a section from the DoD's agency-specific DFARS, but 225.502 is not a separate contract clause. The standard solicitation provisions and contract provisions under the DFARS will typically begin with a 252.2 because the DFARS is located at 48 CFR Chapter 2. All right, let's go to 3. Let's go to number 3. Josh, really?
True or false? An undated contract clause will automatically refresh when a clause is updated.
Is it A, true, B, false, or C? Dave, I don't know what to believe. I've been told both answers. What do you guys think about that? An undated contract clause will automatically refresh. Joshua, can you put that up for us?
Yep. If your answer is C, you can go ahead and send it through the questions tab.
All right, looks like most of you are coming in. We'll give it 3, 2, 1. Let's go ahead and close that out. Okay, most of you have said false. Let's see, let me pull up my questions tab here. Okay, nobody answered C on that one. Okay, C is a little cheeky and clever. Look, I'm sure actually some of you might say, I have heard it both ways, but yeah, look, I'm not your lawyer, but I'm your friend. It's false. The fact that you put it in there and say, oh, it's automatically going to refresh, that's not the right way to think. If you say have contract clause that say these clauses will automatically refresh, that could do it. That could actually do it to automatically refresh your clause, but not necessarily just the reference itself. Each clause has a specific date so that the government and contractors alike can know the exact contract requirement. The contract specific terms are typically set on the date the parties sign the agreement, absent a later modification to the contract. Unless the contract states that provisions will automatically refresh. Again, I see that contract language sometimes. It's atypical. If I was the other side, I would push back on that because I don't want my contract as an organic beast like the blob that's constantly growing. I want to know what it is confined to the four corners of the document. If you have contract term that states the contract will automatically refresh, then it may. But otherwise, the terms do not change unless the parties separately agree, and that will typically, it should be in writing. Leaving a clause undated does not help manage risk. It introduces ambiguity and confusion into the contract because it could be unclear as to what specifically the parties agreed. As a practical matter, especially when flowing down contract requirements, many prime contractors will leave clauses undated, but that does not mean that the clause will automatically refresh. More likely, it means that the version of the clause that was in effect on the day the contract was signed will probably control. All right, looks like most of us got that right. Okay, number 4, Joshua Lee.
Alternates and deviations will automatically apply to a contract if a contracting officer makes an mistake and includes the wrong version of a provision or clause. True or false?
A, true, B, false, or C, it depends. And in fact, I noticed that I have made a mistake in the way I wrote that. So I'm sorry. I try to proofread these, but there you go. So what's the answer on this? Alternates and deviations will automatically, that's the key here, apply to a contract if a contracting officer makes a mistake and includes the wrong version of a provision or clause. True, false, or it depends. Most of you are saying false. Let's see here. We'll give it 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's close that out, Joshua Lee. Most of you say false or it depends. As a lawyer, I typically love these it depends answers because, well, oftentimes it does depend. Now, but my official answer is B, false. Generally speaking, the version of the clause that is listed in the contract will govern the relationship between the parties. If there's a mistake, the parties will usually just have to live with it. And this is one of the reasons that it's important to carefully review draft solicitations and to provide inputs to the government during the solicitations question and answer period. While the government tries very hard to make sure the proper provisions and clauses are listed, everyone makes mistakes. And I regularly see this where clients say, don't you mean this version of the clause instead of that version of the clause? Shouldn't it be this date, not that date? Shouldn't it be this deviation? And oftentimes the government agency will say, oh, yes, thank you for pointing that out, and they will refresh that. Now, answer C could be correct here. So everybody who answered C, I'm going to give you guys credit too, because it is possible that the Christian doctrine could operate to apply a particular version of a clause if the contracting officer made a mistake. But here's one of the key caveats on this. This is unlikely. In order for the Christian doctrine to apply, the clause must reflect a deeply ingrained strand of public procurement policy. And an alternate version of a clause or a deviation, by their very nature, they don't usually reflect policies that are deeply ingrained. A deviation, most likely not, because it is by nature an aberration, right? This is something new. It's different. And a standard alternate clause that's been there for decades, maybe. The courts that have considered this issue have been slow to expand the Christian doctrine under these unique circumstances. And so I'm not, I have seen, I think, occasionally maybe an alternate substituted for the standard clause, but courts are just really reluctant to expand the Christian doctrine. So the answer C, it depends, could be right, but that's really for a very narrow set of circumstances. Typically speaking, when it comes to alternates and deviations, the face of the contract, it is what it is. Okay, last question here, Joshua Lee.
Where can I find complete copies of the specific FAR solicitation provisions and contract clauses listed in a solicitation or contract? A. Online at acquisition.gov or ecfr.gov. B. The solicitation or contract. C. The contracting officer. D. Loose leaf or hard copy versions printed by publishers. E. All of the above.
All right, so let's throw this poll up. What do you guys think? Where can you get copies of these things? A through E. All right, we'll give it just a few more seconds. 3, 2, 1. Most of you answered all of the above. That is the right answer. And so, in point of fact, everybody who answered something different, you also were correct. But it is at all of these places. I think most of us access them online nowadays. But look, the other locations are certainly available and open to you. Solicitations and contracts do not normally list every single FAR provision or clause, although many may be set forth in full. Contracting officers will typically direct vendors to online resources for complete copies of the clauses, and they usually have kind of standard boilerplate language directing you to that. But nonetheless, the FAR directs the contracting officer to make available complete copies of the various provisions and clauses upon request. Other companies publish hard copy versions of the FAR. The National Defense Industrial Association, Wolters Kluwer, even the Government Printing Office publishes these, and these could prove useful. These hard copy versions become quickly outdated and when the regulations are updated, so online resources are probably for the best. All right, thank you. We are at time. Joshua Lee, can you put up the polling questions? But I'm now going to come back and answer questions from anybody, and I'm going to try to do it quickly to try to not keep you here too much past time. Kim chimes in. She says, you can't get complete clauses in the contract if IBR. I don't know what IBR stands for. It may be that they're not all, if incorporated by reference. And that's true. That's true. But you can nonetheless ask the contracting officer for copies of those things. Terrain says, David, you're truly brilliant. And I love you. No, she didn't say that last part. She says, thanks for making this complicated and confusing thing helpful. You are certainly welcome. Let me see here. Stacy says, if a mistake is made, can it be corrected by bilateral agreement? And the answer is yes. You can always change your contract by bilateral agreement, or maybe in some circumstances, if the changes clause applies, the government can implement it through a unilateral change. But keep in mind that changes often can and should require consideration. So if the government's substituting a different clause that gives them more rights and imposes more cost on you, you should consider whether that bilateral change is in your best interests. Terrain also says, if a term incorporated into the contract through the Christian doctrine relates to the agency's interpretation of the contract as being in the government's best interests, oh goodness, sorry, I've lost my screen here. Do you think the recent changes to the Chevron doctrine would limit the application of the Christian doctrine? Yes, I do. The reason being for that is because I think Christian doctrine is something that they try to limit in the first place. And so further expansion based on agency discretion, I just don't really see that happening. James chimes in and says, the FAR has a matrix to determine if a clause is incorporated by reference or full text, but does the DFARS have anything similar for the 252 clauses? And I do not know the answer to that. I would look at DFARS 252.3 and see, but I'm not really sure on that. James also says, doesn't FAR Part 12 and possibly more specifically 52.212-5 allow tailoring of certain clauses to align with industry norms? And the answer is yes, in some circumstances. In truth, I often struggle with this where, you have I looked at the, use the example of the human trafficking clause. It says you're supposed to flow down in principle. And so a lot of times companies, get scared when they see a regulatory reference. But if you can get them to agree that my company does not traffic in persons, that's going a good way toward it. So I do agree, James, that I've never seen anybody getting in trouble for flowing down a federal policy, but nonetheless failing to flow down a specific clause. I think the government tries to be much more flexible on that. Audrey says, can you tell if a deviation is a class deviation or individual just by the citation title? Usually, gosh, I'm trying to think on that. Usually when it's a class deviation, it will often reference that specifically. If it's a deviation unique to that specific clause or to that specific contract, it will say it specifically in the contract. But one of the ways you can find out if it's class deviation or unique to your contract, you can also just Google it to find out, okay, is it been generally published by the agency? And if so, that can help. Angela says, what is the incorporated by reference and the other information that's on slide 16? That slide 16 graphic was from 52.3. That's the matrix that is created for 52.3, and you can find that by scanning on that QR code. Let's see here. I think I've caught just about everything. All right.
Hey David,
Mike
we have
says,
some.
why is it a bad idea to use all of 52.2 all of the time? And Mike, that's a great question. Sometimes people are like, there's a blunt solution here. But my problem is that it's not tailored. And what it means is that if I'm a government customer and I'm flowing all this stuff through, how many people am I scaring off? If I'm a prime contractor and I'm just pushing all this through, am I really creating more burden and scaring people off from my supply chain? I think, look, I think we can negotiate a contract so that it says and means exactly what we want it to say. And I think just putting in all this flotsam and jetsam and is just not necessary here. I think that we can tailor this through. And it takes time and it takes some knowledge and flexibility, but there you go. All right, James says, I've been doing this in some aspect for 15 years and still learn new things today. So James, I thank you. I appreciate that. I try to be a little lively, but I think it's always good to get these refreshers and revisit why it is what it is. Mike Sanchez, this is the last question, I think, here, and then we're going to drop. He says, isn't limiting flow downs a risk for contractors? And the answer is yes. But here's the thing. If it's not a risk for you at the prime contract level, is it really a risk that you're taking on? And I say this because there's a lot of times there are contract clauses in a prime contract that just don't apply. So why do you have to flow those down? And people say, well, because it's in my contract. Yes, maybe. But this is where we get into the fiction of self-deleting and where I dislike it, because if it doesn't apply, let's just get it out of the contract instead of pretending that it's not in the contract. But look, accepting contract clauses is risky. Limiting the flow downs is risky. And so a lot of times when it comes to the subcontract prime relationship, there's a little bit of tension in that there. But I do also think that flowing down more contract clauses than necessary, flowing down everything in 52.2 is a little overkill. And I think we can do a little bit better than that. So I guess that's my bottom line that I want to leave you with. I appreciate everybody for staying a few minutes longer, answering some of the questions here. If you have any additional questions, feel free to, give me, reach out, give me a call, or otherwise, my contact information is on this. Anyway, sorry. There we go. That's what we want. There's my contact information. And thanks for your patience. I hope you guys all do well, be good to each other, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Josh Willie, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks so much, David, and thank you all for joining today. If you guys have any questions for credit, let me know. If you are looking for a certificate, make sure you log into our website under your certificate and courses. If you have any issues with that, we're more than happy to help you. If not, I wish everyone a wonderful afternoon, and we hope to see you again. Thanks, David.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it very, very much. We'll see you.